the special board meeting for May 24th, 2021. Welcome everyone here and introduce our participants today. To my far right, we have Lynn Town, Clerk of the Board, Dr. Stephen Cook, Superintendent. I am Jen Brumley, Chair of the Board. To my left is Rebecca Smith, Vice Chair. To her left, Casey Morrisroe, Trustee. To his left, Lisa May, Trustee. And to her left, Tambra Pickford, Trustee. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Do I have a motion with regards to our consent agenda items?
So moved.
Any discussion?
I have a question. Ms. Ebner?
Yes.
Aye.
Hi.
Could you just explain the leadership premium or leadership awards, just kind of what's happening there?
Yes, we've had a very interesting year as far as leadership premiums go. Last spring, the appropriations budget was set pre-COVID shutdown. After the shutdown occurred, Governor Little did a budget redo with instating a 5% holdback. And a portion of that budget redo was cutting out leadership premiums. And throughout the year, it was understood that even though the legislature hadn't approved his budget redo, that it was likely that it was going to be accepted as it was redone. And the legislature did not end up enacting cutting the leadership premiums. So here we are in May of the fiscal year, hearing that we will indeed receive leadership premiums for the current fiscal year. And that will be paid out next month. We need to expend all of these funds in the current fiscal year, or we have to pay that payment back, or any portion that we don't expend in this fiscal year, we have to pay it back next year. So it's a little bit's an understatement. It's very difficult to, having gone through the year, understanding that we would not receive these funds. When, these funds, we make up job descriptions for employees that they are to follow up with their supervisor throughout the year and report back on, the types of positions that they're doing all year, and then they're paid at the end of the year. So it's difficult at this time of year to kind of look back at job descriptions that nobody, was being offered or formally agreeing to do. So we've come up with a plan in order to pay that. A large portion of leadership premiums go to our hard to fill stipends. We have a number of positions that are hard to fill just based on being paid on our certified salary schedule. Positions like SLPs, school psychs, they could be in private practice making more in some situations. So we have hard to fill stipends. So that is sort of a not as difficult way to allocate the bulk of leadership premium dollars. However, there's still some left that we are allocating to principals based on their certified staff members, their total. And then principals are to identify staff members that have been doing additional work throughout the year and allocate the stipends that way. Does that help?
Trustee Morrisroe, may I add to that a little bit? I would just add that the districts across the state first found out that we were going to be expected to allocate these funds in early April after these cuts were made. And the notice we were given by both the State Department and by the governor's office was that we were legally bound to do this because they're in statute, and that there may have been some remission on their part to include that in the cuts when they made the cuts early in the year for those 5% cuts. And so essentially, and I can tell you that there was a tremendous amount of frustration with that announcement after we already spent a tremendous amount of frustration into each and every district that had to absorb these, because we had to pull these funds from our staffs, from our leaders, from our people that we've typically acknowledge their service through these payments. And so that happened early in the fall, and then in the 1st of April was when we first received the guidance that we were going to be expected to do this, rather than them taking some kind of legislative action on the statute to allow either a 1-year waiver or something along those lines, or to allow us to we even asked for the opportunity to carry them over for the following year and to be exempt from this 1-year allotment, and they refused on many, many levels and said it was absolutely expected that we do this and that it be in accordance with the statute, and that what you see before you is our best attempt at doing that equitably and in a fashion that seemed reasonable in such a very short amount of time.
So usually on these, I think we approve them in the summer, kind of prior to the start of the school year. In these positions, people have been doing that work all school year with the expectation they weren't going to get the additional stipend. Is that correct? And now they are.
Right. In most cases, employees have continued to do their leadership stipend-related duties without the plan of being compensated.
Thank you.
All right, any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Thank you, Katie, for that. All right, moving into then why we're here. Starting with Dr. Cook here and then turn it over.
Thank you, Chair Brumley. As you know, this is going to be a unique budget. Katie and I have met many, many times to talk about the uniqueness and to make sure that we had all aspects covered with some really interesting and a lot of conflicting moving parts. She is going to do her best, I think, to present this budget to you in a fashion that accounts for changes made at the state level and an infusion of federal dollars that are going to be spent over the next probably about 3 years, I think, generally. And so I'm very proud of the work that our finance team has done through the leadership of Katie Ebner. So I'm going to ask that she present that to you here today for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Chair Brumley, trustees, this, like Dr. Cook mentioned, has been a very interesting budget year. And mostly, I think, throughout the year, we've had so many changes through the current year budget. Going into next year, it's a little bit difficult to even, look at the budget next year without expecting the same thing to happen throughout the year next year, mid-year changes, that sort of thing. It feels like, we've thought we had solid footing a number of times throughout this year, only to have it changed. But what I think my goal is to present what I feel most confident in how I see the year kind of playing out with the district's finances, and then get your input as to where you see, if you feel that the projections are reasonable, if you feel that the estimated costs are kind of feeling reasonable as far as being in the ballpark. And then going into our budget hearing, that's a point where we've already run in the newspaper a summary of our budget. And so you typically hear budget hearing and feel like, oh, that's the place where somebody's going to come and ask for an addition to a budget or a reduction. The budget hearing is in Idaho. Our budget needs to be pretty much set by that point in order to have it presented to the public, and then the budget adoption occurs a week after for us. So in this meeting, I'm going to go over a pretty broad overview of the district budget, and then just sort of see where you're all at as far as feeling comfortable with some of the projections that we're looking at. So feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. If you want me to go more in depth, this will be a pretty broad overview. There's a lot going on this year as far as adding in the ESSER money, the restrictions there. So we'll try and get through it all. This document may look familiar. This is sort of the format we've been using the past 2 or 3 years. It's proven to work pretty well, especially for negotiations purposes, sort of just looking at the budget as revisions to the prior year budget. And so in walking through, we go through our general fund special payments. These are smaller payments coming into our general fund. And I'll go over them pretty quickly, but sort of the long story short with these payments is the state will sometimes pay us more or less in some of these categorical funds, but it doesn't necessarily affect the program that we're running. For example, in the state budget this year, content and curriculum was cut entirely. And that doesn't mean that we're going to reduce our content and curriculum spending, because that amount is a very small portion of our overall curriculum budget. So basically what we do as far as a budgeting process is we look at what the state's going to fund us, what metric they're basing it on, what do we project that metric to be, and then just come up with a projection. And so this year, the overall bottom line for the general fund categorical payments is $173,000 less. Two things going on there when you see less money on these line items. The first thing is we are budgeting for a significant decrease in support units and ADA, as well as enrollment compared to prior year. So if you recall, last year, we built a budget during the shutdown, and we had enrollment, just kind of the stats on that was about 11,000 kids, 515 support units, which is the driver for our funding. And we didn't know that we would have a decrease in enrollment at that time. So we budgeted on what we had, actuals. Going into this year, we had a very significant drop in enrollment. And throughout the year, it's been about 900 kids. And so we're budgeting for that this year. We know that's the case. We're not budgeting for the full drop in enrollment because we're hopeful that, coming out of COVID, coming out of restrictions, or, families that may have felt uneasy sending their kids to school, we're hoping that we will gain some of the students back. So we're not budgeting that full drop, but we are budgeting a drop in our revenue metrics that are based on kids. So that will explain a portion of some of these drops. And then the other side is some of these payments where also the distribution factor was cut. For example, safe and drug-free schools, that distribution factor was cut, I think, like 50 cents per average daily attendance. So not a huge cut, but they were, some of them were revised, and we saw some bigger decreases. Any questions on some of that? So going into our foundation payment, this is the big earner for the school district. So this is really important to get these numbers close to where we think they're going to be. The unit distribution factor increased quite a bit for this year. And so, if you take our reduced units, we are building this budget on first reporting period units of 500. And if you're not familiar with units, the easiest way to think about units is a classroom of students. For example, 23, I believe, like third graders will make up one support unit. 23 third graders showing up every single day will earn the district one support unit. So pre-COVID, we had 515 first reporting support units. Going down to 500 is an impact on our budget. Thankfully, there were increases in unit distribution, and there was movement on the career ladder for the salary-based apportionment. That sort of softened the impact of going from 515 units to 500 units. So just back of the napkin to tell you what the impact of a unit is, about 103,000 is what I was calculating past couple years. One thing to note is that this year we were funded on enrollment. that's a pretty huge change to the way that the state formula works. Average daily attendance, we lose quite a bit as far as kids just not attending. So, and it depends on the grade level that you're talking about, but sometimes 3% less in certain grade bands. So when you're taking that, when you're converting enrollment to average daily attendance, you want to make sure that you're budgeting on fewer students. So going into miscellaneous local revenues, supplemental levy will budget the full amount. That is based on what the county bills out to taxpayers. So there wouldn't be any change in that because we've gone to the voters to have that approved. Our investment earnings, interest rates were earning us quite a bit the past few years. They've gone down, so it's likely not wise to budget for that full line item there. I sort of based it on this year's actual. So our tort levy, that Idaho code allows us to levy a portion of our liability insurance. So that is calculated through a code formula. About $200,000 is what that comes in at. Transfers in from other funds. Historically, we've taken a transfer in from our Medicaid fund. We receive revenues for billing on students eligible for Medicaid, providing services that are eligible for Medicaid. And there are federal funds that we can charge sort of an overhead rate for those federal funds allowable by code. So we always make sure that those are coming into the general fund. We've got our other local revenue. Some of the bigger ticket items there would be, I'm trying to think of sort of the larger ones, laptop disposals, and sometimes we receive dividends from insurance, that sort of thing. So that line item we just kind of leave about the same each year, unless we know that we're expecting something. And then this part, this is pretty significant. So last year we balanced our budget on just under $1.7 million worth of CARES funding. That was that first CARES allocation. We knew about it when we were building the budget. We had cuts that we were working in. So we budgeted for that, just sort of offsetting cuts in our in the overall bottom line of the general fund. And that was allowable in order to continue services through the pandemic, to keep the district operations consistent with all the unknowns as far as decreases in enrollment. So that was just sort of to stabilize the budget, going into the unknown, especially with decreased enrollment. You don't want to right size your budget necessarily if you may have students coming back the year after. So
Katie, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Do you know just roughly what was the amount of them that was cut from the state? Was right about 1.6, or do you have a
Yeah.
number on that?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember, but I remember it was very close as far as I don't want to say for sure, but I remember it was sort of coming down to typically we'll receive an increase in state funding. And so we not only didn't receive an increase in state funding, but we also were dealing with some cuts as well that the CARES money was able to offset.
I've had a few community members ask me, so it would just be nice to have just a rough ballpark so we could tell them. I remember it being about that, but I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah. And one thing that we're doing differently this year, we're not including, we could include some of the ESSER money to sort of be the plug-in at this level right here, but I feel that we need to be very intentional on how we're allocating the ESSER money. We need to see what our budget looks like without that federal money, because it's not permanent. It's not a permanent piece of our budget. So we need to be ready for the day when we don't have, a couple $1 million to plug in here. So overall, our total, should have changed the title here because normally we're working with new general fund revenues, but we're seeing a decrease. And mainly that's, pulling out that CARES line item is the main driver there. If it weren't for that, we would see an increase because of these state increases here. But I'm not done talking about state revenues. I'll save another piece of information that's very significant for the end here of this document. Next thing we do in our budget process is we take a look at what we've budgeted for kind of big ticket line items, and then we see if we were off, if we need to make some revisions as far as going into the new year's budget. And I spent quite a bit of time talking about these first two line items in our budget subcommittee meetings. Realistically, we had quite a bit of certified staff savings and quite a bit of classified staff savings. So this year, there were a couple of things going on, like I mentioned before, a drop in enrollment. So that would drive less of a need for staff in general. And then we also had most of the year we had Wednesdays as the collaboration blended learning days. So that would drive that would drive less need for some of our hourly staff. And we tried to keep as many employees whole as far as working where they're needed as cleaning and that sort of thing, but there were savings in the end. And so we talked a little bit about, this is more of a philosophical sort of conversation. It's not like, oh, we should budget these numbers because the graphs say this or the statistical analysis says this. This is more, how do we feel, going into next year, how some of these numbers are going to come in. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that we're not really at that place where we should be focused on right-sizing our staff, our employee, or our budget based on enrollment, because we still don't know if all of the kids that we lost are coming back next fall. It's difficult to hire certified staff, or in this area, it's difficult to hire staff in general, and we need to make sure that we have adequate staff to meet all the kids that are coming to us next fall.
Yeah, and Kay, just to that end, I know last year we did, we knew cuts were coming, and we were opening up an e-school and we wanted everything to be budget neutral. So we ended up with class sizes again at high school that were large. So when I see this, and we talk about being cautious, but we know going into this next year, our high school enrollment has been the most stable of all of our enrollment. Have we built in writing those large class sizes at the high school level?
We are doing our best to staff the high schools. I know the high schools have been a whole different story when we're looking at staffing, but we are basing it on, what was your staff in FY20, what was your enrollment, what's your enrollment that's, looking like the projections that are going to come in, and then what's your staff now, and we need to make sure that our staff is staffed to the same sort of level that we were pre-pandemic, so driven by the number of kids. So the long story short with these revisions, we could have cut these line items if we were just going off of actuals. How much did we spend on certified staff? How much did we spend on classified staff? Let's cut, make it look closer to actuals. We would cut these more. However, with expecting more kids to come back, we decided this projection is showing meeting in the middle more so than cutting the full amount. Then some smaller revisions as far as PERSI. These are based off of those revisions. And then we have every year, one of the largest savings we have in the budget is removing all of our retirees' resignations, and then replacing them with more rookie staff, so that the difference between someone at the top of the salary schedule replacing that staff member with someone, some of them will be brand new teachers, some may be from other districts with experience. So you want to replace them with a mix to get sort of what your cost is or your savings.
Dr. Cook, are we seeing kind of traditional numbers as far as retirements?
Yeah,
Higher?
no, it was fairly stable. It was, as you know, I think a couple of years ago, we added in a slight incentivization for early notice of retirement. And we've seen that be pretty helpful, helps us get noticed earlier and helps reward those for noticing us a little bit earlier. And it's been fairly consistent ever since we've put that into place.
So we get to this point where we're taking the new general fund revenues or the cut general fund revenues, and you're netting with these just sort of revisions that aren't really based on any adds to the budget. They're just sort of truing up your costs. And you get this total new money for working with in the budget, which is typically a more impressive number, but just under 175,000 this year is what we're projecting. So then we come into this portion of the budget where we add in things that were added outside of the budget process. And one of the first line item here is the current year. It says prior year here, but the current year, FY21, employees were paid their steps, lanes, and then the district covered the insurance increase or the percentage increase for the premium. And let me make sure I get that right. So we continued to cover the same percentage of the premium, which when the premium increase was an increase for the district. So that a portion of that was ratified by the board and the CEA just after the budget was adopted, or it might have even been before, but it was past the deadline to publish in the newspaper. So last spring, a half a step and covering insurance was the agreement that was ratified with contingency language to reopen negotiations if more than $500,000 of federal funds were received. So fast forward to the fall, it was announced that the district would receive coronavirus relief funds, which 3.5 million, I think, is the ballpark of what that was. So negotiations were reopened. And in that, there was a ratification that also included a one-time stipend for additional work due to COVID. And then there was contingency language that if revenues came in higher, we would award the other half of the step, experience step, and then education lanes. And the reasoning behind that was the coronavirus relief funds, federal funds, they couldn't be used for anything that wasn't an additional cost to respond or mitigate COVID. So that funding would not be used for steps and lanes. However, if we had ongoing funding from the state, that would be an acceptable revenue source. And so we ended up with the ESSER 2 and 3 funds that were announced. It was recommended and the board approved, I can't remember what month it was, to reinstate the other half of the step in the lanes. So that was sort of the process that was involved, but this is the whole total right here of that package that we ended up landing on as far as compensation for staff. That's an ongoing cost to the budget, so it needs to be added in.
Just to clarify, because that's a lot of confusing information, so thank you for taking your time on it. This year, FY21 full steps and lanes is for this, so we're paying in the arrears essentially.
Right.
So moving forward, well, we're paying for this year with next year's budget.
We need to
So maybe I don't understand.
We need to include in our budget the full cost of what was given for the current year. So because the budget was set prior to doing any of the ratification, nothing from that initial settlement was included. And then later on, those were added during the current fiscal year. So When we look at building the budget this way, where it's a revision of what the prior year's budget was, and that wasn't included, so we are revising to include this piece as an ongoing part of our budget.
Like for me, the easiest way on that, let's say when we approved our budget last year was 80 million. We added $2 million in cost after that budget approval by agreeing to do these things. And so that $2 million is here for next year. So really our budget last year was 82 million. And so she's adjusting it here to reflect that $2 million.
Okay, and then I've left as a line item here, just, there's been some communication from our association that when these lists come out, it feels like maybe they're getting the leftovers as far as the budget process. And it's difficult to include something that we haven't been able to negotiate. And so if I were to put a cost as far as what I thought that the settlement would be, that would be bad faith. And, I wouldn't necessarily want to guide anybody in that process. And so I've just left it there as a reminder that, we do have negotiations coming up, and there's a cost to ratifications. So that's just to explain that little blank line item. Then we've got just some costs that we have every year, $130,000 to meet the new state minimum salary for certified employees. And I included, typically we don't put this on the already committed, but it's been clear that the health insurance increase has always been a priority as far as negotiations. And so by putting it out there, it's frustrated some of the CEA team, I think, in past years. And so, that is something that the district could choose not to do. But the cost was pretty low this year, so I went ahead and put it on there just as far as when we're getting down to the bottom line. So bus driver salary, we ended up raising the minimum bus driver wage to $14.41. Some of these are just mid-year operational changes that we really couldn't get away from. We need bus drivers to drive our students, with a lot of employers in the area offering more and more. We need to be competitive. And so this was something that was a mid-year change that needed to happen. Another one along those lines was subpay. I think that we're working on trying to get it up to 110 at this point. So we're budgeting that cost. Workers' comp insurance increase. Unfortunately, we have a very high mod rate. That is something that Eric is going to work on as far as implementing safety procedures, trainings to ensure that our staff are able to avoid injuries, stay safe at work, and hopefully that mod rate will come down. But that was a really large increase this year that we're going to have to budget for.
That's like the third year in a row, it seems like, we've had big increases with them.
This one was,
That's like 50%.
yeah, when I received the invoice, I just put it on my desk and I'm like, that's a mistake. I'll call them about that. And unfortunately, they walked me through it. It was not, so. Liability insurance increase, again, we're seeing about the same increase we saw last year. The explanation for that is increasing property values. The replacement cost is higher, as well as they base it on enrollment, of course not on current year enrollment because it's much lower, but I don't know that they, I think they have a look back period. And then there were some national market influences that they have to buy reinsurance, so the costs were going up there. We're seeing that one kind of creep up every year. Each year we budget for moving principal assistants to the admin salary schedule. Currently, we will start out a principal assistant as they're new getting into administration. For 2 years, they'll be on a principal assistant rate of pay, and then we move them to the admin salary schedule after the 2 years. I'm looking at Steve, making sure I have that right. We've got a cost for adding the K-12 magnet school. That's the additional cost for office personnel, administration, custodian. So we want to make sure we get that in the budget. Now, the full day K, this is a lot lower than the presentation that I shared. And I was hoping it would be lower going into next year. The main driver of that is fewer kids. So we wanted to look at the cost as far as what we could foresee as a reality of what our budget is going to see after, COVID and when we see a more normal enrollment. And so those costs were based on pre-COVID numbers plus 20%. And this year, we did add additional kindergartners because offering full day K, we expected to see more interest. However, in that the early registration, we weren't seeing the numbers as high as what we were expecting on those projections. So I think it's good to keep that number in mind because that's where we'll likely end up being. But this year, it's kind of nice not to take on that whole $1 million.
Katie, can I ask you about that? So are we using any literacy funds, or is that just included, is that baked in, that we just don't have a line item in that bucket? But is this like general fund, or are we using any other funds to
We are using all literacy funds to support full day K. If you think back to the presentation, it was a while ago, pre-district-wide full day K, we were paying for a number of full day K teachers out of title for our southern schools. And once you make full day K district-wide, you can no longer use title funds. That would be considered supplanting, not supplementing the programming. So in order to take on that, we did not fully expend K-3 literacy. We left some budgets for the schools that they've come to rely on. But beyond that, we've allocated all of K-3 literacy money for the full day K. So this is on top of that.
And is that then also doing away with the sliding scale for those schools that weren't the initial opt-in schools? So there no longer will be a sliding scale for all day K, or not a sliding scale, but a fee, I should say.
Right. Yeah, it'll be free for all students, which statewide, I'm going to go off a rabbit trail really quickly. Statewide, there are the fee lawsuits against districts, and that is one that is starting to, get questioned more and more, and it's starting to feel, like that may develop into something more. So I think that the safest way to get out of all of that that issue is to do full day K district-wide for free. So. Okay, and then we need some curricular materials for those additional classes out there. And then sewer cap fees and water cap fees, this is going to be an ongoing cost to our budget. We are behind as a district on sewer cap and water cap fees. And so this is beginning the process of catching up our schools on those fees. And Jeff's not here. If you want to elaborate, I'll give you the basics, I know. Okay, student advisory group, we just wanted a line item for if there's any trainings or supplies that we need. HR, we lost Kelly Ostrom this year. She's retired and enjoying it, and we have Eric on board. He's doing great. We ended up replacing a 30-year employee isn't always easy, so we ended up reorganizing, adding a staff member to take on some of the state reporting that is every year increasingly more difficult. And then staffing reclassifications, another one of those mid-year changes that just sort of operational decision. And then we increased the pay for lunch duties. It was very difficult to find lunch duties at the secondary level, so that line item is in there. And then last but not least, unfortunately, Atlas just finished its grandfather year for Title I funding, and their numbers didn't increase. So we're building into the budget what all of our non-title schools receive, which is a 0.5 intervention teacher or a full-time para. Okay, so we'll go through these really quickly.
Just really quick, how does our bus drivers pay relate to area schools and other districts just in our area? How does it compare? Do you know? Or maybe Eric knows.
We're a little bit lower.
Eric, can you step up to the?
Absolutely. We are a little bit lower than surrounding areas of Lakeland and Post Falls, and a little bit higher than if you go a little bit further out. We do pay a little bit better, but we are still what I would consider significantly below what it's going to take to continue to have a stable of bus drivers. And we are operating right now on the very fingernail of being able to keep enough buses moving.
And would you say that is directly related to pay? I mean, is that the driving influence there, or is there other factors?
I think it is the driving influence, because when you start to consider that you can go to KFC and fry chicken for $15 an hour, and you can drive a bus with 60 kids behind you, be completely responsible for it, have to have professional credential in order to do it, and you're getting paid $14.41 for a part-time gig.
Yeah. Okay.
Gets to be a little bit difficult.
Do any of our drivers get benefits? I thought in the past that was
They
kind
they
of a-
do. It really limits. They do, and it's a good thing, right? But our bus driver pool then becomes people who are perhaps retired, second career, or whatever, and you can't. It really limits the pool you're drawing from. So it's great that they can do it and take advantage of the benefits, but somebody who wants a career, somebody who's looking to support a family, you can't do it. So you're basically drawing on 50% of your labor pool, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Thanks. Just wanted to shine a little light.
Yeah.
there. Thanks.
Okay, the next area we'll go through are cuts to restore. You may remember last year, in order to balance the budget with the 5% holdback, all those state revenue cuts, we made a number of line item cuts, and we talked about how it needed to be temporary. So, you can make cuts in a year, but a number of these aren't forever cuts. For example, we bought fewer buses this year, and it put a lot of constraints on our transportation department. There were instances where there was concern with having enough buses to do activities, even the limited number of activities that we had this year. We weren't even, doing our full field trips and that sort of thing. So these are line items that we knew we needed to reinstate, and so this year in the budget, I'm showing them as reinstated. That brings us to our bottom line of, the budget revisions, the changes to revenues, net with the increased costs and the cuts to restore, you get about a $5 million deficit. And we knew we would be working with a deficit this year. With the ESSER money coming in, we knew that we would have potential to backfill any deficit in our budget. And one thing to keep in mind going through, we do see some increases to state revenues. However, if you compare them to FY20 revenues, they're not as significant of an increase when you're comparing to the reduced revenues we've had this year. And you also have to take into consideration, we've now had 2 years of movement on the career ladder and our salary matrix. So that cost, the increases just following the trend that we've had, we've typically been able to afford steps, lanes, insurance, and then in a good year, maybe a percentage increase. That we're not seeing that sort of increase in our budget. So that's partly due to drop in enrollment, then also partly due to some state revenue factors. In this is a very important piece of the current year budget, and I'll do my best to explain it. But hopefully the takeaway is that we need to keep an eye on our state revenues this year. And so I'll start from the beginning. So the Public Education Stabilization Fund was created by the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee in order to ensure that the state appropriations budget could be set with projections. And then if there weren't enough, if the projections were too low, the budget would still be funded. So the Public Education Stabilization Fund, the state has gone typically to that fund in order to balance the budget mid-year. And this year in the legislative session, that was frozen. So the state appropriations budget for education cannot dip into that fund in order to ensure that there's enough funding to cover all the districts. So what that means, we don't know as far as how that's going to affect our revenue, because how we're paid, we'll get our information as far as where we're tracking for units, support units. We'll get all that information. And then in July, after 15 days after the fiscal year ends, the state's going to sort of look at the budget and see, oh, did we have enough to cover everything? If they didn't, they'll cut the distribution factor in order to balance the budget. So we'll find out after our fiscal year has ended how much we're being funded and how much, if we're going to receive a cut. And how do you estimate what that cut's going to be? The best way that districts are estimating this is by taking how much we dipped into we as a state dipped into the Public Education Stabilization Fund in general, and that's about $33 million. And then we'll take the district share of the state budget, like what percent our district is of the state budget, and apply that against the 33 million. And so what that comes out to is 1.1 or 1.15 million of cuts that we'll potentially be seeing after the fiscal year has ended. So in the JFAC documents, it's called out that districts are to use ESSER money to make up the difference for this. So districts, we're not unique in this situation where we're, working with a budget that does not balance, and we're also looking at a pretty big deficit. This, the intent on the state level, from what I've saw in talking points and JFAC documents, was that districts are supposed to be using ESSER money to balance their budget. So the joke has been that many people are spending our ESSER money, and the state has spent some of it too. So that's the joke. Not very funny. All right.
Katie, can I ask a couple questions on that? I want to make sure I understand. So on this worksheet, you're taking last year's budget, and then these are adds to last year's budgeted. It's not actuals, correct?
Right.
So do we, and I know it's May, and I know it's months from when we have an audit, but do we know how expenditures compare actuals versus budgeted? Like,
Yes.
are we going to hit the nail on the head, or is there a surplus? Are we short?
Yes. So this year, I didn't go too much into how this year is going to pan out because it's been such an odd year that's not really going to affect how we set our budget. However, we are looking at likely, I think in the budget subcommittee, I stated $500,000 to $1 million deficit, and the difference between, that's a pretty wide range. But our fund balance deficit will vary based on year-end purchases. Like we make some large computer purchases when staff have time to process the incoming shipments. Curriculum's the same. So I think it's looking more at $1 million deficit. And so this is not a surprise, hopefully, because through the spring, we've been talking about not only our decrease in units compared to what we budgeted. When we set our budget, we didn't know that we'd have such a sharp drop in enrollment. So our units came in lower. 503 is what we're looking at versus the 515 we budgeted. So that's an impact. And then also the state distribution factor was cut quite a bit as far as discretionary money for this year. So that was one of the many revisions that we've seen through the current year budget. So our state revenues will be much less than what we budgeted. So, and that was shared, I believe, February board meeting might have been the first time. And then, so yeah, that's going to be the impact. And if you think back to, I think it was last fall when I walked through the FY20 fund balance, ending fund balance, we had a surplus that was unexpected in FY20, and that was due to the way that the state calculated revenues during the closure. So I'm sort of looking at the 2 years as they were both sort of one-time situations for the budget, and they'll offset in the long run. And so we'll see a deficit this year, but we had a surplus last year, and they sort of net.
That number's kind of shocking and sad, right? To look at that total available funding for budgets. But hearing that, I guess, like I just had my light bulb moment, because you have your 1 million potentially that we're short. You had 1.7 million in federal funds, that CARES funds that aren't in this year's budget, and you had $2 million in steps, lanes, and those sorts of things, which is $4.7 million.
Yeah. Yep. And then you add in the public education freeze, and it adds up very quickly as far as what the deficit is. And these funds, the federal funds are one time. They span 2 years plus a few months into the third fiscal year. And so what we'll get into next is it's not allocating these federal funds. It's not coming up with a budget. It's really, truly managing them in a way that the district can continue to operate, and also sort of wean off of them as we hit that third year when they won't be available. So.
Katie, can I just ask like an open-ended question? It's mostly just a comment, and I think it's also a comment that it's sad that we're playing games now with budgeting, and it's really important to this community that we live within our means. We hear that all the time. You're pro at it. That's why we're really conservative in budgeting, and so it seems as though the legislature is saying, well, we know you're going to be getting federal one-time funds, so we're going to hold back. But at what stage, like you said, does it all finally catch back up? And so it's creating an impossible situation for us to go into the community and really talk about fiscally how we're doing. Can you comment on that? Or, what would be your comment if you were doing a Q&A and someone said, wow, that's a pretty scary number. How do you explain that? Because it's hard even for us to understand, and we have all the data in front of us.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be political in any way. I think my position is an apolitical position, but in the documents, it says that the state was intending for cuts to be made and for districts to backfill with ESSER money. And so that is, it's not just me saying like, oh, we need some ESSER money to balance a budget that, otherwise we wouldn't be able to balance. Like, this is truly, the state revenues, we've come to expect the state revenues to pay for operating costs that we have every year, and they're not coming in this year at a level to cover operating costs. And my hope is that by the time that these funds are not a piece of our budget, that will not only, start seeing those increases, but also be caught up to pay for, the increases that we'll have over the next couple years.
I think that's wishful thinking. I think sitting in this position makes me awfully uncomfortable because it's easy to forget, if you're a legislator and you're, oh, they live without these funds for 3 years. And so what if they don't ever make us whole again? And I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves, or at least we need to talk about in a way that is very non-political, because I agree that that's not the issue. It's really creating budgets that are safe and fiscally conservative and transparent. And this is the most difficult budget I've seen yet.
Yes, and then you have to balance the fact that in a year when we're, you'll see the $19.5 million as the total, to say no or to make cuts when you have that big, number you're looking at is very difficult. So it's rock and a hard place at this point, because you want to ensure that costs are one time, but then you also, will go into a situation where staff are negotiating for their education that, they've earned, and, saying no to awarding an education movement on the salary schedule is, really difficult in a year when you're seeing $19.5 million. So that's just sort of the rock and the hard place.
I think Trustee May makes a valid point there, that we have to be cautious about what does the future hold. This is, I think, my 6th budget that I've gone through, and I don't think we've ever seen a $5 million increase in funding from the state, and that's what it would take to make us whole without the stabilization fund freeze. And that's scary, because we know that's not gonna be made up next year or the year after, and so we're maybe kicking the can a little bit. At some point, there's gonna have to be some truing up to deal with that.
And you make me think of one other point that, we're laying a lot of this at the state's feet, but there is a piece that affects our revenue to a great extent, and that is the change in enrollment. So if there were a scenario where we are back up to those numbers, we would see a jump. And the other hand, too, is if we don't, hit those numbers, we will need to make decisions with our budget. And doing that gradually, it's less of a difficult scenario, because you have resignations every year, and you can sort of do it in a way where you're not laying off employees. And but though that, I think, is a big factor here as far as the concerns going forward. Some of it, we do need to hopefully see some increases from the state larger than prior.
I just did some quick math too, and I think that's optimistic, but even if we were at our normal enrollment, that's only $1.5 million. That's not gonna get us quite there yet. So I think that's optimistic and it's hopeful, and I have confidence this community our enrollment will increase again, but it still wouldn't be enough.
Right.
It just wouldn't, even with the steps and lanes.
All right, any other questions on this piece? We're kind of in a place where jumping over to talking about the ESSER 2 and 3 funds makes sense, because that is what is going to meet that deficit of 6.1 million as far as just building our basic budget. So in this document, I've got 2 columns here, learning acceleration, and then general use was kind of the term I came up with for the ESSER money that's not, doesn't have strings attached. And learning acceleration, also known as learning loss in the grant, there's a 20% set aside from ESSER 3 for learning acceleration. And I don't know if now makes the most sense. Seth was going to talk a little bit about learning acceleration. I think I'll just go over just the overview, and then we'll jump into learning acceleration. Then we'll talk a little bit about the general use. So we've got in year 1, 1.2, about half of that learning acceleration funding. And then year 2, continuing the programming. And then year 3, that funding goes through that summer. So there would be a third summer as far as the learning acceleration. And then the general use, we have this sort of step down effect. So we see this 6 million, that's where that figure is coming from, or this figure is coming from what we just talked about, $6 million deficit. And then we've got staff retention through the pandemic. So acknowledging the fact that it's been very difficult on staff. And this isn't a set in stone figure. I just sort of back of the napkin, how would it look as far as managing this funding in a way? And if something, for example, like steps and lanes for next year were to be awarded, that's where that would land, because FY22 steps and lanes was not included in that document that we just looked at. So that would be an example of that's not already accounted for in the budget. We have this line item to sort of look at some of that stuff. Mitigating COVID or preparedness for pandemics in general. So you'll see that we kind of came up with this outline of how the cost should fall within the guidelines of the grant. And these are all called out in the grant. And we'll go through, we have a prepared list of priorities that the district leadership team came up with and then further prioritized amongst the team. So we'll go through some of that.
Hey, Katie, can I just clarify one thing? And I know I sound like a total Debbie Downer, but avoid disruption in services through balanced operations budget. That's essentially deficit spending, whether the state isn't reimbursing us. We're just acknowledging deficit, essentially.
Right. We could cut $6 million out of our budget, but that would likely feel like a different school system than we've experienced in the past. So it's avoiding disruption as far as giving the same level of service to our students that we've been able to pre-pandemic.
I think, Trustee May, what I'd like to add is just simply this idea that the ESSER dollars are to be spent over a period of 3 years, and this trying to start off by spending a large chunk to balance this fiscal year 22's budget, and then hopefully working our way off of that reliance on the ESSER dollars to make those budgets. The goal would be that at the end of year 3, we've only had to use the final $1 million of this allocation to fill in the gap. But essentially, as you can see from this step-down plan, that we've mapped this out so that the ESSER dollars are used to fill in the holes that the state is not funding.
I think that's a disappointing part, and I'd like to see what other states are doing and how many of them are having to use those funds to cover deficits in their budget because the state is not fully funding. And I think it's something that we need to do a better job of understanding and talking about in our community, because it's going to get brought up again, time and time again, and these funds are already controversial, and I think this is going to make them even more so.
All right, so when you add up year 1, 2, and 3, and you compare to your total revenue, you see that that's sort of the overall plan for allocating the funds. I'm presenting this as more of a, we're taking our first stab at how we see these funds working within the district's budget, how we foresee paying attention to the fact that, they're gone pretty quickly as far as building them into the budget. So it's not to say that this is going to be, they've got every dollar, has to be allocated as such. But I think when you see the lists of priorities and you see how long that list is, when you're saying yes to something on that list, you're also saying no to a number of things. And so it's important to see the entirety of that list, because you'll likely see things that we feel a lot of pressure as a district to take care of. So do we want to jump into learning acceleration budget?
Katie, before you go, I have a question. So just so I understand, the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 funds have to be spent in 3 years. Is that correct?
So it's pretty easy. They made it a little bit easy as far as ESSER 1 needs to be expended by September of 2021, ESSER 2, 2022, and ESSER 3, 2023. So I'm looking at them more as kind of a total, because in that, ESSER 2, if we truly are allocating $6 million to avoid disruption in service, to balance the budget, then the mechanics of I'm going to charge, $6 million of expenses this year in order to meet that grant deadline. Does that make sense?
Yes. I just want to make sure that it's understood, that I'm understanding that there's no way that we can hold back those funds or plan out 5 years worth of spending on those, or that those requirements it has to be spent, or do we return the money and do we actually have to show where they went?
Yeah, so there is some flexibility as far as, if you're saying, for example, avoid disruption in service, you could charge a number of staff members to the grant for 1 year with the understanding that we may need to have let them go if we didn't have, a balanced budget with this ESSER money. And so you can do some of that and still stay within the guidelines of the grant and then, supplant. There's no supplement versus supplant requirement is, I guess, what I'm getting at. So if it's a cost that you're already going to have, you could supplant and then have that be part of your fund balance. I think if you're doing that with all of your money, that may get some attention as far as like what's going on here. So I wouldn't want to do that to a full extent for the grant, but I think it, just as you see, year one and year two, that's a pretty big step down going from 6 million to 3 million as far as that figure that's going to plug our budget. So even if we really wanted to stretch it out for 5 years, it probably wouldn't be possible with the amount that we're needing to finance operations at this point. Thanks. Okay. Somebody want to poke Seth? See if he's awake? No. It's okay. I don't know where is it up there? Okay.
Good afternoon, Chair Brumley, members of the board. It's my pleasure to talk about the Learning Acceleration budget, which you'll find on page 3 of that document. So what we did as an instructional core group was we took the 2.7 million and then we divided that up by some of the topics that we talked to you about. Dr. Nichols and Dr. Roscoe presented to you last month. So excuse me, as you might recall, there's 2 positions that we were recommending for that, a Learning Acceleration Coordinator as well as a Learning Acceleration Specialist. Both those positions are posted right now. We also have line items for both elementary and secondary learning acceleration. So that would be programs like CDA Reads, the Learning Buses, some of those summer programs that we're starting this summer and then we'll expand on starting in the summer of 2022. At the secondary level, that would be summer recovery, intervention, the AP academies, all those are starting this summer. And then we also have a line item for enrichment activities, and our plan for those is primarily partnerships with community organizations that we're already working with, such as the University of Idaho, Gizmo. We've talked with NIC and a couple others. Again, we're trying to just get those started this summer and then expand on them down the line. And then for after-school programs, we've got a line item for that as well. One of the things we're talking about doing is supplementing our 21st Century grant. Right now, that's after-school programs at a couple of schools, and it's just a few days a week. So we're talking about how we could expand that to 5 days a week and perhaps be in more schools. Also, as you know, we have our School Plus program, and so one piece that we've talked about there is adding some enrichment or some academic activities to our School Plus program. And then we have a line item for professional development, and that would be just 2-year programs for long-term instructional improvement. So we really want to tie back to the learning in the classroom so that we can help those students kind of get ahead. And then we've got a line item for both software licenses and supplies and books. And then a couple things that really became clear in our research of summer programs and after-school programs. One is the importance of having academies for those transition years, so kindergarten, 6th grade, and 9th grade. And so that's something we would start in 2022. is having like week-long academies for those grade levels to kind of get those kids a jump start as they enter into a new school. And then another one that just came up time and time again in research was having a tutoring program for targeted students, just what a huge difference that makes. And so that's something we'll be relying on that coordinator and that specialist to help us really get started as a pretty robust tutoring program. And then lastly, we put a line item on here too for family engagement. And for that, we're thinking things like materials and resources that we could send home with students for families to use at home. So obviously this is in draft form. We want to be able to revisit this with the coordinator and the specialist. As Katie said, with the rest of the ESSER 2 and 3, we have until September of 2023. And so our vision is that next year around this time, we'll be revisiting this for next summer and maybe making some adjustments as kind of things come up and we know more about some of the programs. But this is at least our first stab at this. So any questions about that? And I had one more thing I was going to share with you as well.
I guess my only question would be, a lot of these programs are great programs that I know we'd want to continue, but that would require an add then moving beyond 23. So the 24 budget, is that like things like the tutoring program? We've needed that for years, and how exciting that we're finally talking about it, but seeing that it'd only be funded, this is for 2 years, is that right? 21 and 23?
It gets a little bit confusing, but it's through September 2023. So that program would continue through then. We kind of have it stepped out so that we can spend all the funds by September 2023. So that summer of September of 2023 would be the last year for those programs unless we continue them some other way. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So one other thing, this kind of throws a little monkey wrench into some of our work. 2 weeks ago, we learned about the governor's learning loss grant. And so this was actually proposed at the state level back in February, but then just passed by the legislature, I think earlier in May. This application's due the end of this week, so it's a pretty quick turnaround for us as a district. There's some formulas to allocate the funds, and so at K4, there's about $140,000 that would be allocated, but that's in this fiscal year. So this is money that has to be expended by June 30th. There's also about $80,000 for K-12 learning loss, and again, that's in this fiscal year. And then at K4, there's funding for next fiscal year, about $290,000. However, for any of these that we got, we would have to test our students on the IRI or the interim ISAT between the 10th of August and the 10th of September. That's problematic for our district because obviously we don't start school until September 7th. I've been in contact with the State Department of Ed about these dates. We're all pretty frustrated by this because we feel like northern districts are not being considered in this. Unfortunately, their answer was, that's in the law. There's nothing we can do to change that. The other complication that we see is that regardless of whether they're fiscal year 21 or 22, all of these funds have to be spent by December 30th of this year. And so that's complicated because this is meant to be for summer programs. So at this point, I think our instructional core's opinion would be that we don't apply for it. I think with the $2.7 million from ESSER, we feel like we have enough funding to do the programs that we want to do without so many strings attached and a really tight timeline for our teachers to test their students within the first 3 days of school. In talking to the Department of Ed, they don't see a problem with that necessarily. The funds are allocated based on who applies, and so the districts that apply may be able to take advantage of our district not applying, so that just goes back in the pool for the state. I did talk to them a little bit about, what if we applied and we weren't able to use the funds? That gets a little bit tricky for them because then that money's allocated to us. And then if we wait until the very end of the deadline to return those funds, then it makes it harder for other districts to use it. So we've been having conversations about this, but it's complicated because of the tight timeline. I think had this been passed in February, it might have given a little bit more time and a little bit more runway to get some things done. But like I said, we just learned about it 2 weeks ago after it passed through the legislature. And some of the strings that are attached give us pause when we're thinking about implications for next year.
Seth, is it possible that you guys can apply for just part of it? Like, it seems like that's a no-brainer, K-12 learning loss, that's summer school, paid for, X number of students. We can definitely use those dollars, as we just saw. So can you apply for the K-4 learning loss, K-12 learning loss, and we really get after a summer school program? I know that we were struggling to pay staff adequately, but this would sure help us fund those positions at a level that might make it worthwhile. I just hate to turn away any dollars when we've just gotten this news. I don't know that our community would look highly upon us. I understand
Right.
there's difficult strings attached, but that's real dollars.
Yeah, the tricky part is just with the strings attached. It's not funding that you could just go and use for anything. It's very specific about summer programs.
Well, we're
And then
offering summer-
test, and then the students that you have to test, it doesn't just say the students in the program. It says you've got to test your students. So meaning all of them from our understanding.
Yeah, we're having summer school anyway. I don't know why we wouldn't apply to at least try to offset some of those costs, because then we have those funds moving forward. Every student has to be tested? That seems, we have to retest all of our students again, even if they're not participating in the summer school programs?
That's our understanding of it, yeah, because they're wanting to see growth for all of your kids. We can try to get clarity on some of that, but because the time was short, I wanted to make sure you all knew about it so that we could either apply or not apply, depending on what your desire is.
I tend to agree with Trustee May. I really struggle with not trying. Even if we couldn't do it or some logistic came up that we didn't test our kids, that you could explain and justify, I guess. Is it ideal? Absolutely not, to ask your teachers to test kids in the first week of school, but it just seems like a lot of money to walk away from. And I'd like to say I could recognize the amount of work that would go before this Friday to do this, but I just don't know how I justify it to somebody asking me why we didn't do it, because it just seems like it's because it just seemed too hard, and I don't like that answer.
Any other questions? That's kind of it for the learning loss, learning acceleration part.
I guess I would just say I would tend to agree. I'd rather see us apply for it, and if we can't do it, then we can't do it. But I hate to say, we just can't do it, and not figure out a way. But I don't know.
Is there a way to go?
Maybe you just pick those grades. Use the funds in the grades that they don't have higher or nice at. We're going to use
there
these
a way
funds
to
for
go-
12th grade, 9th grade.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's district-wide, but we'll get clarification on some of those and then
And we
submit the application and go from there.
we recognize how much work that is, but I think if there's any way to go back to our teachers and say, hey, we've got funding, but to look at Katie's budget right beforehand and
Yeah. I think the biggest concern we had was just with all the strings attached. If it was funding that we could use for anything, I think we're right there with you. But the fact that the window closes 3 days after our school year starts is going to make it really challenging to get all of our kids tested. So that was the main concern. I'm going to turn it back over to Katie to talk through this last piece.
All right. So this is the last piece here. We're looking at, I'm going to flip back at the overall ESSER kind of proposed budget. We're back on this general use column, the non-strings attached budget. And we're looking at these line items that are mitigating COVID or preparedness for pandemics. And so those are allowable uses of these funds. And we thought about some costs. district-wide that we know that we have, that we need to cover, and how they would fit, or costs that would fit within that category, that allowable use. And the total of the two is $2.8 million between year one and year two. And it, wouldn't necessarily have to be, we tried to focus on one-time costs in general. So if we were able to finish it up in year one, then we would allocate it that way. So it wouldn't necessarily land in those years exactly if the board were to want to move forward on some of these. So this is a prioritized list. The total is so much over the total of funds that are available, but we did want to show, if we're saying yes to some of these, that we do have to say no to some other items on here. And the one that rose to the top is HVAC. And the reason is that those units really need to be replaced, and it fits within the grant guidelines. HVAC is called out as an allowable use. Preparedness for future pandemics, that would sort of fit in that category. And it's one time, so it's sort of hitting all the check boxes as far as what would be a good use of these funds. And so that rose to the top. And then a K-12 magnet facility, that would be a one-time cost as well. Secondary wireless access points, those fit within more of the technology needs as far as that we've seen going through COVID this year. And then those units are expiring. And an added bonus is we can get some E-rate reimbursement on those. So we always look for, trying to maximize any additional revenues that could come in. So those are a high priority as well. They're one-time costs. For now, we have to, replace them every 5 years, but they're due to be replaced. And then Portrait of a Graduate Development, continuing some of the work that's being put in there, and safety protocols, that ties into our high mod rate and ensuring that we create a safer environment, reduce those injuries, and get hopefully our premium down, make our staff safer, that sort of thing. So the first top priorities fit within that $2.8 million allocated. So just looking for some, I know that you've just seen it over the weekend, but some direction if you feel like something's missing up there that you would like to see. We are trying to keep these to one-time costs. We have a lot of ongoing costs, like the next one, classified staff wages, that is way up there as far as a priority. That would be an ongoing cost. So it's hard to make it fit within this budget beyond the ongoing deficit that we have to deal with at this point. So any questions or comments on this list?
Katie, I think my only comment would be, as much deferred maintenance that fits into the requirement that we can get done would be amazing with these funds. It's not looking like we're going to be going to the community anytime soon for any sort of M&O levy, so anything that we know might be in the near future. I know there's a few things on the deferred maintenance list that rise to the top, including the HVAC at CHS, but there's some other HVAC and a few other things that I have been percolating for a while, so anything that on that list that we could check off.
All right.
All right, is that everything?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Anybody else have any comments or questions? Yes, Trustee May just said thank you, but yes, thank you, Katie. I know it's a lot of work, and Seth as well with the other list that came forward, and whoever was working with you on this. I know this is not easy, and it's frankly very scary, I recognize, to put numbers on paper and then make them public. So thanks for your courage in that too, and just your transparency and your honesty in all this, Katie. We do really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate all your time on this.
Okay, well, if nothing else, we'll adjourn. Thank you, everyone.